Let the day fade, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift into the story of a man forged in fire. You are not only resting, you are entering a tale of endurance, of conflict, of power gained and tested. A tale of someone born with nothing, yet destined to reshape a nation. Listen and let the rhythm of the words carry you deeper into calm, even as they reveal the turbulence of a life. I was born into struggle. My first cries rang out not in a great house or city street, but in the raw frontier of the Carolinas. The year was 1767, though I did not yet know what years would bring. My father died before I could remember him. My mother, left alone with 3 sons, bore the burden of our survival with hands that never rested. Poverty was our constant companion. We had no fortune, no legacy, no inheritance, only will. The land where I grew was unsettled, rough, and contested. Forests stretched endlessly, fields turned to mud with rain, and the threat of violence always lurked near. The revolution was stirring even then, whispering its call across colonies. For me, childhood was not laughter but labor, not safety but survival. When war came, it came to my very doorstep. I was still a boy when soldiers in red coats swept through, their boots heavy on our soil, their muskets aimed at neighbors I had known since birth. I carried messages for the militia, young though I was, too young to fight but old enough to serve. It was then that I first learned what it meant to face danger with nothing but courage. But war spares no one. My brothers joined the fight, their blood given for the cause of independence. Disease and battle took them both, leaving me the last son. I too was captured, thrown into the hands of soldiers who cared little for a boy's life. I remember the sneer of one officer, the demand that I polish his boots. I refused. His sword came down, leaving scars across my face and hand. Scars I would carry all my days. That moment taught me something. Pain fades, but pride does not. I would rather bleed than bend. My mother's love was fierce, but fate was cruel. She too was taken from me, lost to sickness while caring for prisoners of war. By the time the revolution ended, I was an orphan, scarred in body and soul, standing alone in a world that had given me little. Yet even in loss, a fire burned within me. The world had struck me down, but I would not remain fallen. Hunger made me sharp, pain made me hard, and loss made me relentless. Where others saw a boy broken, I saw a beginning. I grew with temper in my veins, a temper quick to ignite. My pride was brittle, my honor easily challenged. I fought duels, arguments turned violent, words too small to contain the fury inside me. Some called me reckless, others called me dangerous. Perhaps I was both, but I knew this much: I would not be ignored. Poverty had taught me endurance. Orphanhood had taught me independence. War had taught me defiance. These became my weapons, sharper than steel. And so, step by step, I began to carve my path, not by inheritance, but by ferocity, not by wealth, but by will. I studied law, not in grand halls, but in the corners I could find, the scraps of education I could seize. And with it, I stepped into a new world. A world of courts, contracts, and power wielded not by swords, but by words. Yet even there, my temper followed me. My voice was sharp, my arguments fierce, my presence demanding. Judges scolded me, rivals feared me, and yet clients trusted me, for they saw in me not refinement, but fire. I was still young, still unpolished, but already the outline of what I would become had begun to take shape. The orphan of Carolina, the scarred boy who defied soldiers, the man who would rather bleed than bow. That was the root of me, and it was only the beginning. Because a life forged in hardship is a life destined for conflict, and conflict would follow me, as faithfully as shadow follows flame. Let the day fade, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift into the story of a man forged in fire. You are not only resting, you are entering a tale of endurance, of conflict, of power gained and tested. A tale of someone born with nothing, yet destined to reshape a nation. Listen and let the rhythm of the words carry you deeper into calm, even as they reveal the turbulence of a life. I was born into struggle. My first cries rang out not in a great house or city street, but in the raw frontier of the Carolinas. The year was 1767, though I did not yet know what years would bring. My father died before I could remember him. My mother, left alone with 3 sons, bore the burden of our survival with hands that never rested. Poverty was our constant companion. We had no fortune, no legacy, no inheritance, only will. The land where I grew was unsettled, rough, and contested. Forests stretched endlessly, fields turned to mud with rain, and the threat of violence always lurked near. The revolution was stirring even then, whispering its call across colonies. For me, childhood was not laughter but labor, not safety but survival. When war came, it came to my very doorstep. I was still a boy when soldiers in red coats swept through, their boots heavy on our soil, their muskets aimed at neighbors I had known since birth. I carried messages for the militia, young though I was, too young to fight but old enough to serve. It was then that I first learned what it meant to face danger with nothing but courage. But war spares no one. My brothers joined the fight, their blood given for the cause of independence. Disease and battle took them both, leaving me the last son. I too was captured, thrown into the hands of soldiers who cared little for a boy's life. I remember the sneer of one officer, the demand that I polish his boots. I refused. His sword came down, leaving scars across my face and hand. Scars I would carry all my days. That moment taught me something. Pain fades, but pride does not. I would rather bleed than bend. My mother's love was fierce, but fate was cruel. She too was taken from me, lost to sickness while caring for prisoners of war. By the time the revolution ended, I was an orphan, scarred in body and soul, standing alone in a world that had given me little. Yet even in loss, a fire burned within me. The world had struck me down, but I would not remain fallen. Hunger made me sharp, pain made me hard, and loss made me relentless. Where others saw a boy broken, I saw a beginning. I grew with temper in my veins, a temper quick to ignite. My pride was brittle, my honor easily challenged. I fought duels, arguments turned violent, words too small to contain the fury inside me. Some called me reckless, others called me dangerous. Perhaps I was both, but I knew this much: I would not be ignored. Poverty had taught me endurance. Orphanhood had taught me independence. War had taught me defiance. These became my weapons, sharper than steel. And so, step by step, I began to carve my path. Not by inheritance, but by ferocity. Not by wealth, but by will. I studied law, not in grand halls, but in the corners I could find, the scraps of education I could seize. And with it, I stepped into a new world. A world of courts, contracts, and power wielded not by swords, but by words. Yet even there, my temper followed me. My voice was sharp, my arguments fierce, my presence demanding. Judges scolded me, rivals feared me, and yet clients trusted me, for they saw in me not refinement, but fire. I was still young, still unpolished, but already the outline of what I would become had begun to take shape. The orphan of Carolina, the scarred boy who defied soldiers, the man who would rather bleed than bow. That was the root of me, and it was only the beginning. Because a life forged in hardship is a life destined for conflict, and conflict would follow me, as faithfully as shadow follows flame. The boy who had lost everything did not remain a boy for long. Grief has a way of aging you, of stripping away innocence until only defiance remains. By the time I was a young man, the fire within me was plain for all to see. Some called it temper, others called it madness, but I knew it as survival. When the world takes everything, you learn quickly that your pride is the last thing you can protect. I had no wealth to cushion me, no family name to open doors. What I carried instead was a fierce spirit, one that bristled at insult and lashed at injustice. I studied law with little more than stubbornness as my guide. Books were scarce, mentors rarer still, but I devoured what I could. Soon I stood in courtrooms, my voice sharp, my presence forceful, my arguments burning with conviction. I was not polished like the lawyers who had studied in Europe, nor refined in speech like those bred in great cities. My words were rough, my temper quick, my gestures fierce. But that very rawness drew attention. Clients trusted me because I fought for them as if their battles were my own. Rivals cursed me because I would not yield, not even an inch. Judges scolded me, yet they remembered me. I was impossible to ignore. In those years, I discovered another truth about myself. I could not abide insult. Honor was the currency of men, and mine I guarded with a blade's edge. A careless word, a mocking glance, a whispered slight, these I treated as challenges, affronts to be answered not with silence, but with steel. And so I fought. Duels became my language. Pistols at dawn, seconds pacing nervously, the hush of a crowd gathered in secret. More than once I stood with death as my companion, the cold weight of a weapon in my hand, my heart steady despite the risk. Some called it foolishness, others called it vanity. But to me it was a necessity. In a world that had stripped me of father, brothers, mother, and fortune, I could not allow it to strip me of dignity. One duel nearly ended me. My opponent was a man of skill, his aim precise. The shot tore into me, sinking deep near my heart. Blood soaked my shirt, pain seared through my chest, yet I did not fall. I raised my weapon, steady despite the agony, and fired back. He collapsed and I lived, though the bullet remained lodged within me, a reminder I carried for the rest of my days. From that moment on, men whispered of me differently. Not just as a lawyer, not just as a hothead, but as one who would not break even under mortal wounds. Old Hickory, they would one day call me, as unbending as the tree itself. But the name was born first from blood, from the refusal to fall when others expected me to die. Violence marked me, but it also made me. Each duel, each scar, became part of my legend. I was not proud of the blood spilled, but neither was I ashamed. Honor demanded its price, and I paid it. Yet there was more to me than fury. Beneath the temper there was ambition. I had seen enough of poverty to know I would not remain poor. I had seen enough of power to know I would one day claim it. Law became my path, and land became my ambition. I speculated, bought, sold, argued, defended. I carved out an estate, not with inheritance but with sweat, stubbornness, and the reputation of a man no one wished to cross. Still, the fire within me burned hottest not in courtrooms, but in conflict. I was drawn to the militia, to the ranks of men who bore arms not out of duty alone, but out of pride in their homes, their land, their freedom. I drilled with them, fought beside them, commanded them. In their eyes I saw reflections of my own hunger, rough men, hardened by frontier life, unwilling to bow to anyone, whether crown or Congress. I earned their loyalty not by birthright, but by presence. I ate as they ate, slept as they slept, marched where they marched. And when the challenge came, I stood in front, never behind. They called me fiery, reckless, even dangerous, but they followed me because they knew I would never ask them what I would not endure myself. It was in those years that I began to sense something larger rising before me. Conflict was in the air, the nation expanding, pressing against frontiers, clashing with neighbors, straining under divisions between rich and poor, elite and common man. I knew deep inside that my fire was not meant to burn quietly in a single courtroom or a single town. I had been shaped by loss, defined by scars, hardened by defiance. And now, I was ready to test myself not just against rivals in law or dueling fields, but against armies, against nations, against history itself. There was one more truth that drove me, one more ember that glowed within. I did not fear death, not after what I had already endured. The revolution had orphaned me, disease had claimed my blood, a sword had scarred my flesh, and a bullet had buried itself near my heart. If fate had wished me gone, it had ample chance, but I remained. I lived, and I believed I lived for more. Others saw recklessness, I saw destiny, and destiny I knew would call me soon. War has a way of finding me. Perhaps it is because I was born in its shadow, orphaned by its hand, scarred by its blade. Or perhaps it is because some men are shaped not for peace, but for conflict. Whatever the reason, when my country once again called for soldiers, I did not hesitate. The year was 1812, and whispers of war with Britain filled the air. Old wounds had never fully healed since the Revolution. Trade restrictions, impressment of our sailors, the Empire's refusal to see us as equals, all these things pushed us back toward battle. I was already a man of reputation then, a fighter in court, a leader in the militia, a voice for the frontier. And when the call came, I answered with fire in my chest. Command was mine, not of polished regiments with fine uniforms, but of rough men, farmers, hunters, trappers, men who carried their rifles as naturally as they carried their pride. They were not easy to command, nor was I gentle with them. I demanded discipline, obedience, endurance, and I gave in return what I always gave, myself. I ate as they ate, starved as they starved, fought as they fought. We marched long miles across wilderness, the sun beating down, storms soaking us to the bone. Supplies ran thin, hunger gnawed at our bellies. Disease thinned our ranks. Some questioned whether we could endure, but I reminded them that I would never ask them what I would not endure myself. They saw me ride at their front, never their rear, and so they followed. The battle tested us soon enough. Skirmishes with native tribes allied to the British cut deep. The Creek War raged in the south, and I led men into its heart. At Horseshoe Bend we clashed with ferocity unmatched, the ground slick with blood, the river choked with bodies. When it ended, it was our flag that stood, and my name spread with the smoke of victory. But it was at New Orleans that destiny came to meet me. The British marched with confidence, their ranks filled with veterans, their ships heavy with cannon. They believed we would fall swiftly, just as they believed during my boyhood. But I was no longer a boy. I was a general, hardened by loss, strengthened by scars, driven by fire. And I was determined that no foreign army would tread upon our soil without paying dearly. I gathered my men, militia, frontiersmen, free men of color, even pirates who sought redemption or profit. A strange army, ragged and unmatched, but united by purpose. I spoke to them not with polished words, but with conviction. I told them the enemy thought us weak, thought us broken, thought us nothing, and I told them we would prove the Empire wrong. On the morning of battle, the fog hung heavy. The enemy advanced in perfect lines, their drums beating, their muskets gleaming. My men stood behind earthworks we had raised with desperate hands, their rifles steady, their breaths sharp. I watched as the Empire that had scarred me as a boy marched once more upon us. Then the cannons roared, smoke swallowed the field, muskets cracked like thunder. The enemy surged forward again and again, but each time they broke upon us like waves against stone. My men fired with precision, with fury, with the knowledge that behind them stood their homes, their families, their future. Hours passed, the ground littered with the fallen, until at last the British line faltered, broke and scattered. Victory was ours. The enemy, once so confident, retreated in silence, their banners lowered, their dead left upon the field. I rode among my men, their cheers rising around me, their eyes alight with triumph. For them it was a battle won. For me it was something more, it was vindication. The boy who had once been struck by a British officer's sword, who had carried scars across his face and hand, who had watched his mother and brothers taken by war, that boy had stood now as a general and had broken the Empire on American soil. New Orleans made me a legend. They called me hero, savior, defender of the Republic. Songs were sung, portraits painted, my name carried across states like fire upon wind. I had become more than a man. I had become a symbol of defiance, of toughness, of a new nation unwilling to bow. But legend is a double-edged blade, for while it lifts you high, it also places you in the gaze of ambition. People looked to me not only as a general, but as something more. They began to whisper of politics, of power, of presidency. I did not yet know if I wanted such burdens. I was a fighter, not a statesman. My tongue was sharp, my temper sharper still. But the people saw in me something they craved, not refinement, not polish, but fire. They saw in me themselves, rough, scarred, defiant. The war ended, but my battles did not. For once you are given the name of hero, it clings to you, drags you forward whether you will it or not. And so I stepped from battlefield to political stage, carrying with me the same scars, the same temper, the same hunger that had carried me through war. The fighter had become a warrior, and soon the warrior would be asked to become something even more. War had given me fame, but peace gave me restlessness. I had been forged in hardship, scarred by loss, hardened by the clash of armies. When the guns fell silent and the drums no longer beat, I felt the silence pressing against me. Men called me a hero, yet I knew that titles and songs fade quickly. If I wished to shape more than a memory, I had to step beyond the battlefield. Politics was a battlefield of its own. It lacked the roar of cannon and the smoke of musket fire, but it carried weapons just as sharp. Whispers, lies, corruption, schemes woven in back rooms. I was not bred for such halls. My voice was rough, my temper quick, my manners unpolished. The elites of the cities looked at me and saw only a frontier brawler, a duelist, a man too coarse to sit among them. But the people saw something different. They saw themselves. I was not born into wealth. I did not inherit a name that opened doors. I had clawed my way upward, scar by scar, wound by wound. I had fought in fields they had never seen, marched barefoot through mud, endured hunger and pain. I spoke in plain words, not the polished phrases of scholars, and in those words the common man heard his own voice. So I entered politics with fire in my chest and defiance on my tongue. At first, my steps were uncertain. I served as judge, as representative, as senator. Each role placed me among men who doubted me, who whispered that I was unfit, too unrefined, too dangerous. But each time I stood firm. I did not hide my temper, nor soften my words. I struck hard, and in striking, I earned both enemies and followers. My enemies were many. They called me reckless, accused me of violence, of corruption, of ambition, too wild to trust. And perhaps some of it was true. My anger burned quickly, and my sense of honor often led me into clashes that others would have avoided. But my friends, my supporters, they saw in me a champion, a man who would fight for them as fiercely as he fought duels, who would defend their rights as fiercely as he defended his own pride. It was not long before whispers of higher office began to swirl. The presidency, a prize I had not sought but could not ignore. The people clamored for a man of the frontier, a man who spoke their language, a man who was not afraid of elites, banks, and polished gentlemen who thought themselves born to rule. My name spread, carried on wind and word, until it reached even the highest chambers of government. In 1824, I stood for the presidency. I campaigned not with refinement, but with passion. My story was my weapon, the orphan who had risen from nothing, the fighter who had bled for his honor, the warrior who had saved New Orleans. My opponents spoke of policies and philosophies. I spoke of the people, and the people listened. When the votes were cast, I won the most of them. The popular voice, the cry of the nation, was mine. But politics is not always the will of the people. In smoky rooms and whispered bargains, my victory was stolen. The House of Representatives, guided by men who feared me, chose another. They called it compromise, I called it betrayal. The corrupt bargain, they named it later, and so it was. My enemy, John Quincy Adams, took the presidency, while his ally Henry Clay gained power in his cabinet. They thought I would bow, accept the loss, fade into silence. But they did not know me. I had bled too much, lost too much, endured too much to be broken by trickery. The people knew it too. They saw the theft as I saw it. Their outrage burned as hot as mine. Farmers, laborers, frontiersmen. They swore the next time would be different. They swore they would not allow their voice to be silenced again. In that moment, something larger than me was born. A movement, a force, a tide that no bargain could contain. They called it Jacksonian democracy, but it was more than a name. It was the cry of the common man against the elite, the push of the people against the entrenched few. I carried their anger as my banner. I promised them I would return, not as a defeated candidate, but as their champion. And they promised me their loyalty in return. I returned home from that defeat with fire in my veins. The wound of betrayal cut deep, but wounds had always been my teachers. I had survived swords, bullets, and winter. I would survive this too. And when the next battle came, I would not only fight, I would win. For I was no longer just a fighter, no longer just a warrior. I was becoming something else. I was becoming the voice of the people. Defeat is a bitter taste, but bitterness can be fuel. The corrupt bargain of 1824 cut me deeply, yet it did not end me. If anything, it gave me something more powerful than victory. It gave me a cause. The people had seen their will ignored, their voice stolen, and they were furious. That fury became my weapon. For 4 years I carried it. I traveled, I spoke, I listened. I let their anger mingle with my own, until it became a fire no opponent could extinguish. They called me reckless, dangerous, unfit, but the people called me theirs. I was no polished statesman, no aristocrat bred for power. I was the orphan, the fighter, the general who had stood with them, not above them. When 1828 came, I stood again for the presidency. The campaign was vicious, filled with slander and venom. They attacked my wife, Rachel, with cruel lies, questioning her honor, mocking her past. They spat on my name, dredged every rumor, every scar, every duel I had fought. They believed the filth would bury me, but it did not. It buried them, because the people saw through it. They had no patience for the polished words of elites, no love for the whispers of corruption. They wanted a fighter, and in me they saw one. They wanted someone who would carry their struggles into the highest office of the land. And so when the votes were cast, the tide was overwhelming. The people's will could not be denied a second time. I rode that tide into Washington, not as a defeated candidate, but as the 7th President of the United States. But victory carried sorrow with it. Rachel, my beloved, did not live to see me sworn in. The lies, the venom, the attacks had weighed heavily upon her, and her heart failed before the moment arrived. I buried her with grief sharper than any wound of war. I took my oath of office not in triumph, but in mourning. Yet even in that pain, I swore to honor her memory by carrying the burden she would never see. The day of my inauguration was unlike any this nation had ever seen. Crowds poured into Washington. Farmers, workers, veterans, ordinary men and women who had traveled miles to see one of their own ascend. They filled the streets, surged toward the Capitol, their cheers drowning out every doubt. I did not stand apart from them. I was of them. They broke open the doors of the White House itself, filling its halls with mud and noise, a raucous celebration that shocked the elites. To some it was chaos. To me it was justice. I had promised to be the people's president, and I meant it. I did not fill my cabinet with the polished elite. I brought in trusted allies, men who had stood by me, men who spoke plain and acted swiftly. They called it the kitchen cabinet, mocking its informality. But I did not care. Let them mock. I valued loyalty over polish, action over titles. I set about tearing down the old ways. Office holders who had grown fat and lazy under privilege were dismissed, replaced with men loyal to the cause. Critics called it the spoils system, corruption of the highest order. But I saw it differently. Why should a handful of men cling to power year after year while the people's will shifted? Rotation in office was democracy in action, not corruption. My enemies in Washington fumed. They called me a tyrant, a king in all but name. They feared my temper, my decisiveness, my refusal to bow to their customs. But the people did not fear me. They cheered me. They saw in me the rough edge of their own lives, carried now into the highest seat of power. The battles I had fought with pistols and muskets I now fought with pen and policy, and I fought them with the same ferocity. Banks, tariffs, nullification, Indian treaties, each became a battlefield, and on each I stood firm, ready to endure whatever storm followed. I was not perfect, nor did I claim to be. My temper burned hot, my enemies multiplied, and my choices left scars upon the nation. But I had never been born to gentleness. I had been born to fight, and as president, I would fight still. The people had carried me to power, and I would not forget it. I did not stand above them, nor apart from them. I stood with them as their champion, their defender, their voice against the polished few who thought themselves masters. And so began my years as president, turbulent, fiery, unyielding, years that would test me as deeply as any duel, any battle, any winter of hunger. For the White House, I soon learned, was not a place of peace. It was only another battlefield. Every presidency is remembered for its triumphs and its shadows. Mine was no different. I was called the People's President, the champion of the common man, the fighter who had carried their voice into the highest seat. But power demands choices, and choices leave scars. Some of mine remain the deepest this nation has ever known. The frontier was always at the center of my life. I was born on its edge, raised in its hardship, scarred by its violence. To me, land was more than soil. It was survival, independence, destiny. And for the people who had carried me to the presidency, farmers, settlers, veterans, land was their cry. They longed to expand, to plant fields, to build homes, to carve futures out of the wilderness. But that wilderness was not empty. Nations of native people had lived upon it for centuries. Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole. They were not shadows, not whispers. They were families, communities, nations, with roots deep in the same soil my people hungered for. Conflict between settlers and tribes was no new story. I had fought in those wars myself, blood staining the rivers at Horseshoe Bend. I had seen their courage, their resilience, their will to endure. I respected it, even as I fought it. But as president, I now faced the question not of battle, but of policy. The frontier could not remain in stalemate. My people demanded land, security, expansion, and I believed the only answer was removal. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 became my weapon. It gave me the power to negotiate treaties, to exchange lands east of the Mississippi for territory in the west. To some it was a compromise, a chance for peace. To others it was betrayal, a tearing away of roots older than the Republic itself. I told myself it was mercy, that moving tribes westward would protect them from the violence of settlers, from the endless clashes that would otherwise consume them. I told myself it was inevitable, that if not by law, then by force, their lands would be taken. I told myself I was sparing them from extinction. But mercy is a word that feels thin when weighed against what followed. Treaties were signed, some willingly, many under pressure, others forged in deceit. Promises were made, yet too often broken. Families were torn from homes they had built, farms they had tilled, graves where their ancestors lay. They were driven westward, mile after mile, through mud, snow, hunger, and disease. Thousands fell along the way, mothers burying children, elders collapsing in exhaustion, lives cut short by a march that seemed endless. They call it now the Trail of Tears, and so it was. I did not walk that trail, but I knew of it. I heard the reports, the numbers of dead, the cries carried in letters and whispers. I told myself again that it was necessary, that it was the price of progress, that it was better than annihilation. And yet, even as I justified, I knew the sorrow was real. History will judge me harshly for this, and perhaps it should. For I was a man of my time, but I was also a man of power, and power could have chosen differently. I chose what I believed was survival for the nation, but survival for one came at unbearable cost to another. Still, in that moment, I stood unyielding. I faced opposition from the courts, from Congress, from voices who said I had overreached. The Supreme Court itself ruled against the removal of the Cherokee, declaring their sovereignty, their right to remain. But I would not bend. I pressed forward, defiant, certain that the president's will outweighed the judgments of others. That defiance, which had carried me through war and through politics, became in this moment both my strength and my shadow. For I achieved what I sought. The frontier opened, settlers poured westward. The vision of expansion realized. But the price was written in tears. The people who had elected me cheered. They saw fields opening, towns rising, a future for their children. To them I was still their champion, still their fighter, still their president. But in the eyes of those forced west, I was a destroyer. And so I remain both. The story of my life is not one of purity, nor of perfect triumph. It is a story of fire, fire that warms and fire that burns, fire that defends and fire that consumes. In the Indian removal, that fire lit paths for my people but scorched others beyond repair. As I look back, I cannot escape it. It is part of me, as much as the bullet lodged near my heart, as much as the scars on my face, as much as the grief of burying Rachel. It is a choice I made, a burden I carried, a shadow I cannot deny. I was Andrew Jackson, the people's president, but I was also Andrew Jackson, the author of The Trail of Tears. Both truths endure. Part 7. The bank war power does not rest only in armies or governments. Sometimes it hides in vaults, in ledgers, in the quiet grip of men who control the flow of coin. During my presidency, no enemy loomed larger in my eyes than the Bank of the United States. To many, it was simply a financial institution, a tool to steady the nation's economy, to regulate currency, to give order to chaos. But to me, it was a monster, a beast with coils that reached into every corner of the republic, strangling the common man while feeding the privileged few. I had lived long enough to know what it meant to be poor, to be powerless, to see wealth hoarded by men who never lifted a plow or bore a musket. The bank, I believed, was their fortress. Its president, Nicholas Biddle, was polished, refined, clever. The very face of the elite I had fought all my life. He claimed the bank was neutral, a servant of the people. I saw through it. I saw an engine of corruption, a weapon for the rich, a tool that bent governments to its will. And so, I made war against it. When Congress moved to renew its charter, I stood firm in opposition. They argued that without the bank, the economy would falter, credit would vanish, chaos would reign. I told them it was already chaos for the farmer drowning in debt, already ruin for the laborer scraping for wages, already injustice for the people whose sweat enriched others. The veto pen became my weapon. I struck down the bill with words as sharp as any blade. I declared that the bank was unconstitutional, dangerous, and unfit for a republic of free men. My enemies fumed. They called me reckless, lawless, a tyrant unbound. They said I had overstepped, that no president should wield such power. But I did not flinch, for the people cheered. They saw in me their champion once again, the fighter who stood against the fortress of wealth. To them, the bank was a shadowy force, distant and untouchable, and I was the man who had dared to strike at it. But the battle did not end with a veto. Biddle and his allies fought back with cunning. They tightened credit, called in loans, spread panic across markets. Businesses faltered, farmers suffered, and they pointed their fingers at me. "This is Jackson's doing," they cried. "His war has brought ruin." I did not retreat. Instead, I pressed harder. I ordered federal deposits withdrawn from the bank, placing them in state institutions. Pet banks, my enemies sneered. They called it reckless, unconstitutional, a dangerous abuse of power. But I believed the nation's money should not sit in the vaults of one institution controlled by elites. It belonged in the hands of the states, closer to the people themselves. The struggle grew fierce. Congress censured me, the first president ever so rebuked. Newspapers denounced me as a dictator, a king in all but name. Caricatures painted me with a crown upon my head, trampling the Constitution underfoot. They believed shame would break me. They were wrong. I had survived poverty, disease, duels, war, and grief. I would not break before ink and insult. I answered not with apology, but with defiance. I told the people I was fighting for them, not for privilege. I told them the bank was a hydra, its heads regrowing unless cut clean off. I told them that liberty was not safe, while wealth was concentrated in the hands of the few. And they believed me. They rallied, they shouted, they cheered. In time, the bank's charter expired. Its power withered. Biddle, once so confident, fell into defeat. The monster I had fought lay slain, though its shadow lingered in the chaos that followed. For without the bank, the economy wavered, speculation surged, and crises would come. My enemies pointed to every panic, every downturn, and cried, "This is Jackson's legacy." Perhaps they were right. Perhaps in slaying one beast I had unleashed another, but I did not regret it. For to me, the bank was a greater danger than instability. It was not just about money, it was about power. And I believed no republic could endure if power was held by the few while the many labored in chains unseen. The bank war defined my presidency as surely as New Orleans had defined my generalship. It revealed the fire within me, the defiance, the unyielding will to strike at anything I deemed a threat to the people's liberty. It also revealed the cost of such defiance, division, chaos, scars upon the nation's economy that would last beyond my years. But I had never lived my life fearing scars. I bore them proudly upon my skin, upon my heart, upon my very soul. And if the Republic bore scars because of me, then let them be scars of struggle, of fight, of endurance. For I would rather a scarred nation of free men than a smooth one enslaved to wealth. I was Andrew Jackson, and I made war upon the bank. And though victory was bitter, it was victory still. Power invites enemies. I knew that truth from the moment I first drew a pistol in defense of my honor. But as president, the danger grew sharper. For every cheer in the streets, there was a whisper of hatred in the shadows. For every supporter who saw me as champion, there was a rival who saw me as tyrant. My life had been scarred by blades and bullets before. I had faced death in duels, in battle, in fever. A bullet had once lodged itself so near my heart that doctors said removing it would kill me. I carried it still, a reminder that fate had tried and failed to end me. Perhaps that is why I grew careless with death, or perhaps I simply believed that if death came, it would find me standing, never bowing. One day in 1835 it came. The air was heavy with dampness as I walked from the Capitol. Crowds gathered, some cheering, some jeering, as always. My cane struck the steps with steady rhythm. Age had bent my body, but not my will. My temper burned as hot as ever. My presence still filled the air like storm clouds. From the crowd, a man stepped forward, his eyes wild, his movements sudden. Before I could react, he raised a pistol and aimed directly at my chest. The crack of the shot echoed like thunder, and yet, nothing. Smoke rose, but no bullet struck me. Misfire. The pistol had failed. Gasps rippled through the crowd, shouts of alarm, screams of fear. But the man was not finished. He pulled a second pistol from his coat, leveled it at me, and fired again. Another crack, another cloud of smoke. And again, nothing. 2 shots, both aimed at my chest, both misfired in the same moment. Later they would call it miracle, providence, impossibility. I cannot say what it was. All I knew in that instant was that fate had given me breath when it should have taken it. But I did not thank fate. I did not stand frozen in awe. No, I did what Andrew Jackson had always done when faced with threat. I attacked. Fueled by rage, I raised my cane and charged at the would-be assassin. My blood pounded, my scars burned. My fury consumed me. I struck him again and again, my cane splintering as it landed upon his head and shoulders. Witnesses rushed forward, prying him away, dragging him down, but not before I had left him bloodied and broken. The crowd roared, half in terror, half in triumph. They had seen their president face death and refuse to fall. They had seen me stand unshaken where others would have collapsed. They had seen once more why they called me Old Hickory. The man was seized, judged insane, confined to institutions. His pistols were tested later, fired dozens of times without failure. Experts swore the chance of both misfiring at once was nearly impossible. Yet it had happened, and so the whispers spread that I was untouchable, protected by destiny, too stubborn for death itself to claim. I carried no illusions. I knew I was mortal, my body weakened by years of war, grief, and burden. But I also knew that survival is a kind of legend. Each scar upon me was a story, each bullet that missed a myth. And myths, once born, grow larger than truth. That day became part of my legend. Children whispered that Andrew Jackson could not be killed. Men repeated that old Hickory was harder than iron, tougher than death itself. My enemies cursed it, my supporters cherished it, but none could deny it. And I, though I bore the truth of pain and weakness, let the myth stand. For myths have power, and power was something I had always known how to wield. The attempt upon my life did not frighten me. If anything, it emboldened me. I had faced kings, courts, banks, armies, and now assassins, and I remained. Each foe that failed to end me became another stone in the fortress of my defiance. I had lived my life in fire, and until fire consumed me, I would burn on. A man does not fight forever, though some part of me believed I might. The years of war, duels, battles, and burdens had carved deep lines into my face, bowed my frame, and filled my body with aches I could not shake. The bullet near my heart, the scars upon my flesh, the fevers that came and went. They were all debts, and in time debts must be paid. When my presidency ended, I felt both triumph and exhaustion. I had stood against enemies within and without. I had carried the voice of the common man into halls that had long silenced it. I had struck at banks, courts, and foreign powers alike. Some hailed me as a savior of democracy. Others cursed me as a tyrant who bent the republic to his will. Both may have been true. I returned to my home, the Hermitage, a plantation built not of inheritance but of ambition, toil, and the strange, cruel world of my time. There I sought rest, though rest was never easy for me. My thoughts burned with the echoes of battles past, the faces of enemies, the laughter of allies, the cries of those I had led and those I had driven from their lands. Yes, even in my final years, the shadows of my choices followed me. The trail of tears haunted the silence, a sorrow carried by the wind. I told myself again that it was necessary, that I had acted for the survival of the nation, that I had chosen progress over stalemate. And yet, when the night grew quiet, I felt the weight of those lives pressing upon me. History, I knew, would not forget, nor forgive easily. But I was never a man who lived for history's approval. I lived for the fight, for the moment, for the cause before me. And when I looked upon the republic I had served, I saw a nation stronger, broader, louder than the one I had inherited. A nation of millions who now looked westward with hope, who believed the presidency belonged to them as much as to the elite. That, at least, was a victory I would not deny. Visitors came often to the Hermitage. Young politicians, eager soldiers, curious citizens. They wished to see old Hickory, the man who had stood unbent when others broke. I greeted them with the same fire I had always carried, though my body grew weaker with each year. My voice, once sharp enough to cut, now rasped with age. My step, once quick and forceful, slowed beneath the weight of years. Yet when I spoke, they still listened. They asked me of battles, and I told them of New Orleans, of the fog that shielded us, of the thunder of cannons, of the moment when empire faltered before ragged men. They asked me of politics, and I told them of the bank, the corrupt bargain, the spoils of victory, the fury of betrayal. They asked me of leadership, and I told them it was not refinement, nor knowledge, nor polish, it was endurance, to stand, to endure, to refuse, to bow. But I also spoke of loss, of Rachel, whose absence I carried like an unhealed wound, of brothers and mother taken by war, of comrades buried in fields far from home, of choices that brought grief to others, choices I carried whether I wished to or not. For even the hardest wood bears cracks, even old Hickory carries scars unseen. As the years wore on, my body betrayed me more. Illness came often, weakness followed. Yet I clung to life with the same stubbornness that had defined me since boyhood. Death had tried many times to claim me, and I had refused it. Even now, I defied it, though I knew the battle could not be won forever. In my final days, I thought often of legacy, not of statues or portraits, but of the story that would be told when I was gone. Some would remember me as a hero, the champion of the people, the general who humbled an empire, the president who gave voice to the common man. Others would remember me as a tyrant, the destroyer of banks, the scourge of native nations, the hothead who bent power to his will. Both were true, for I was never a man of half measures. I was fire, and fire both warms and burns. When death finally came, I met it not with fear, but with the same defiance that had carried me through life. I had endured too much, fought too many battles to tremble before the final one. I looked upon the Republic one last time and knew that though scarred and divided, it still stood. That, to me, was enough. I left behind a nation forever changed, for better and for worse. And I left behind a story, fierce, flawed, fiery, that would echo long after my voice had gone silent. Now the fire grows quiet. The battles are behind me, the duels silenced, the cannons long cooled. What remains is not the roar of crowds or the rage of enemies, but the steady echo of memory. And memory, I have learned, is its own kind of battlefield. I have spoken to you of hardship and hunger, of scars carved into my skin by swords and bullets, of victories that lifted me and choices that darkened my name. But as you listen, drifting now toward rest, understand this. My story is not only mine. It is a mirror, reflecting truths that still endure in your world today. I was born into poverty, into loss, into a life that seemed destined for obscurity. Yet even from nothing, fire can rise. Perhaps you too have felt the weight of beginning with little. Perhaps you have known hunger, grief, or scars that refuse to fade. If so, then hear me. Scars need not be the end of you. They can be the start. They can become the steel that carries you forward. I carried anger with me, and I will not deny it. My temper burned hot, my pride demanded satisfaction. It led me into duels, into battles of words and bullets alike. It gave me strength, but it also left wounds upon others, upon myself, upon the nation I served. And so I tell you, fire can build, but it can also destroy. Learn to master it, lest it consume what you hold dear. I believed in endurance above all. The world tried many times to break me, and each time I stood. That was my gift, not brilliance, not polish, not wealth, but the refusal to yield. And you, listening now, carry that same gift. Life will press you, test you, strike at you when you least expect it. But endurance is yours to claim, to rise again when you have fallen, to take one more step when you believe you cannot. To endure is to triumph even when victory seems far away. But there are lessons in restraint as well. Power, once grasped, is a dangerous thing. I seized it often, bent it to my will, and history remembers both the triumphs and the scars that followed. You may not command armies or lead nations, but in your own life you too hold power. Over words, over choices, over the way you touch the lives of others. Use it wisely, for power wielded without thought can wound more deeply than any blade. And perhaps the hardest lesson, legacy is never simple. Some call me hero, others call me tyrant. Both are true, for no life is pure, no story without shadow. Do not fear this. You need not be perfect to matter. You need not be flawless to leave a mark. You need only to live fully, to fight when called, to endure when tested, to act with conviction even when the cost is heavy. So as you rest now, let my story fade into calm. Let the fire dim, leaving only its warmth to guide you. Breathe deeply. Feel the weight of your own struggles ease, the burdens you carry soften. The past is behind you, tomorrow waits ahead, but in this moment, you are still. Remember this, you are stronger than you believe. Scars are not shame, but proof that you endured. Anger can destroy, but it can also defend. Endurance can carry you through storms you thought would drown you. And though history may judge harshly, Though voices may call you both good and bad, what matters most is that you lived, that you stood, that you endured. I was Andrew Jackson, orphan, fighter, warrior, president. I was scarred and flawed, fierce and unyielding. My fire warmed some and burned others. My name carries both cheers and curses, but through it all, I endured. And so will you. Close your eyes now. Let the noise of the world fall away. Let the story rest where it belongs, in the quiet of memory. The fire dims, the night grows still, and you are safe. Tomorrow will come, but tonight, you may rest. Sleep now, knowing endurance is yours. Sleep now, knowing you carry strength enough. Sleep now, and let the lessons remain with you.